Good morning, everyone. Very, very warm welcome to this London Conference 2023. In case I haven't met you, I'm Bronwen, Maddox, the director. Delighted to say that I've been here 10 months and enjoying every bit of it. I look forward to talking to you during the course of this excellent conference. And this is my first one as director, though not my first one as speaker. It's the way of Chatham House to pull people in over the years, as I trust it is doing with you. It's been a really momentous year. We've had Russia's continuing assault on Ukraine. We've had uncertainty about both China and the US, questions which have a bearing on many parts of our work and on the world. And the big themes of climate change and inflation and debt run through it all as well. The point of this conference is to put a spotlight on our thinking on some of these big questions, to explain why we pick the questions we do, and to take advantage of your thoughts, your experience in advancing our answers to them. That covers both our regional work, our thematic work, things like the environment and security. We want to bring together people who have ideas and solutions to these problems, and a solution does not have to be perfection, just something that improves one of the many problems in the world. And there's an awful lot that is gloomy at the moment. I've felt for some years if you want a shortcut to gloom, you reach for talking about politics or economics or putting the word geo in front of either of those. But there is also a lot that is optimistic about the words that people are putting to the way they want to be governed, whether within their own countries, internationally, and the kinds of technology and solutions that are being created and innovated almost by the hour. And I want us to capture some of that spirit here today. It's incredibly exciting to have such a wide and diverse group of people with us today. We have a map of all the people attending in the course of today, whether online, and a very warm welcome to you too, or in person. And we have people from over 88 countries, more than 1,000 people online today from right round the world. So if you're joining from elsewhere during the course of today, do say where from. We really like to know. And we are here to share your ideas, solutions in the main sessions and in the spotlight breakout sessions. We deliberately bring together today and always an intergenerational group. That is really important to us, has been for years, will be in the future. This is the map of where people are joining us from. So a special welcome to the people joining us are the members of our panel of young advisors, the Queen Elizabeth Academy for Leadership, people we pick with exceptional leadership and intellect from around the world, Common Futures Conversations, the many people, young people in Europe and Africa who have joined those most stimulating online conversations about the problems facing the world. And, of course, the Chevening Scholars we're so proud to have. Thank you all for joining us. And I want to give a special lot of thanks to our supporters for this conference, Diageo and the Stavros Niarchos Foundation. I was delighted to go to Athens last week to the Stavros Niarchos Foundation's own conference discussing mental health. A word of housekeeping for anyone, and we do get those people who think everything to do with Chatham House is under the Chatham House rule. This one is very much on the record. It is being recorded. Some plenary sessions are being live streamed, and the videos are going to be made available on our Conference Plus platform after this event. Please do share your views, all of them, on social media using the hashtag #CHLondon. And we're going to take as many opportunities as we can to hear audience questions, to hear what you have to say, to hear points, not always questions. Just raise your hand when asked, and one of the roving microphones will find you. Those of you joining us online, thank you again for that. Please make use of the chat function, which moderators chairs will draw on throughout the day. And later on, there are going to be these spotlight sessions taking place for our in-person audience. And they'll take place upstairs in this glorious building in the exchange and quarters rooms. And further details will be found in your conference brochure. If you get lost, and this is possible, no room has square sides here, have right angles. There is a map of the venue in your brochure, and there's a huge number of my terrific colleagues around who can show you the way or answer any questions, and I just want to slide in a word of thanks to them for getting this magnificent conference underway. One small change to the program: the awarding of the Chatham House Prize is now going to be at 6:15, pushing the drinks back by 15 minutes, but I am absolutely sure you will want to stay with us for those particular 15 minutes. It is going to be one to remember, I think. There are two other interactive opportunities I've been asked to draw your attention to. There's an interactive exhibition celebrating the 75th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And that's been crafted by our international law program and the Stavros Niarchos Foundation CoLab initiative, supported by the SNF. The center of this exhibition is a human rights tree, which we're all going to build together throughout the day. So in your pack, you will find one of the 30 articles in the Declaration. Please do add your own comments on the back of this card and hang it on the tree when you have a spare moment. And alongside the tree, we're also going to showcase 2 new short films, so do keep an eye out for those. And also in your packs, you should find a wooden token. This will have less appeal for those joining online, but anyway, for those in possession of a wooden token, it corresponds to one of the 3 informal discussions we're hosting in our Ideas Marketplace upstairs. So we encourage you to attend the session corresponding to the token you've been given, or to find someone to swap tokens with if something else piques your interest. But my colleagues are very forgiving if you discover a passion for one of the ones that is not on your token. I'm sure we can accommodate that. The discussion topics and timings are listed in your brochure, or you can also scan the QR code on the back of the token to find out more. So let me come to the theme of this conference: multilateralism. It's an ugly word for something really important. Indeed, one of the words, principles, themes, goals that is at the heart of Chatham House's mission, some of the others being democracy, peace and security, and the environment. As you know, when you registered, we asked for your views on this theme. Which issues you most felt affected this international system of rules and the guidelines for countries working together? How multilateralism can work better in a world of increased geopolitical rivalry and increasing competition. So I'm going to give you now 60 seconds to ask the person next to you what they thought. And while you're doing that, we're going to just put up some of the things, some of the solutions that people among you have suggested to us as things that they would like to see. Right, you have 60 seconds, starting now, to ask the person next to you. Let's draw it to a close there. Just a taster of what we'll be discussing today, but let me show you what you all thought coming into this. This is the word cloud of the words, the themes, the things people thought were either most important or most urgent, the two not being the same, when they were coming into this conference. Thank you very much indeed for that. The word Ukraine, obviously large and central, and that of Russia, too, perhaps bigger than it would have been had we been meeting a whole long week ago. All to discuss very soon. We've picked up this theme of multilateralism because we wanted to take a fresh look at the ways in which countries, institutions, other organizations can work together to solve these problems. And it's all the more important at this point when there have been so many shocks to the globalization, the integration that we had almost begun to take for granted in the past 30 years. China often seems to be explicitly offering a rival model of how to organize relations between people and between countries. and what to expect from China and the US separately and from the relationship between them is an arc over much of our work. So are climate change, inflation, now artificial intelligence, and we can add new topics by the week, as you have here, notably Russia. So what has all this shown? Well, that our current arrangements for cooperating internationally to fix these problems are insufficient. I was talking last night to the chair of our panel of senior advisors, Mark Carney, who made the point, as he has before, that the world, in his argument, needs to mobilize an additional $1 trillion a year just to finance the energy transition in emerging and developing countries and in developed ones to stabilize the outlook on climate change, and raises the question of where this money is going to come from and whether our existing arrangements and institutions are up to that task. So today I'd like to explore how we might reimagine the multilateral system, how we might find new ways to cooperate to solve old and new challenges, whether it's Ukraine, debt, or the AI revolution. From our base here in London, we inevitably look very hard in all of this at the role for the UK. So I'm delighted to say that our first session is going to begin with a keynote speech from the Foreign Secretary, James Cleverly, on just that point. It is the first speech on multilateralism given by a Conservative Foreign Secretary in 30 years, I get there. The previous one being Douglas Hurd 30 years ago at Chatham House. So with that, have a great conference, drinks, dinner, enjoyment of the prize being awarded later, and let me move immediately now to introducing the Foreign Secretary. James Cleverly was appointed Secretary of State for Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Affairs in September 2022. Seems a very long time ago to us, perhaps to him too. He was previously the Secretary of State for Education. He held ministerial roles in the Foreign Office for the Department of International Development and served as a parliamentary undersecretary in the Department for Exiting the European Union. He's been the MP for Braintree since May 2015. Secretary of State, thank you very much for joining us today.
Bronwen, thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. Thank you for joining us all this morning. It was 82 years ago, on the 12th of June in 1941, that the representatives of 14 Allied governments met in London, just 2.5 miles from this very location, and took the first historic steps towards creating today's multilateral system. Their declaration of St. James's Palace made clear, and I quote, that the only true basis for enduring peace is the willing cooperation of free peoples so that all may enjoy economic and social security. 4 years later, by way of Moscow, Tehran, Yalta, Dumbarton Oaks and Bretton Woods, 36 other countries joined the original 14 in signing the Charter of the United Nations in San Francisco on the 26th of June, 1945. The rest, as they say, is history. But the remarkable truth is that by historic standards, for more than 8 decades, the multilateral system that was established by our forebears has actually worked. It has delivered a 40-fold growth in world trade since 1950. It's delivered global vaccines for infectious diseases and fewer deaths in violent conflict than during any comparable period. Multilateral institutions forged the global consensus that people everywhere have the universal human right to be treated with dignity, free from torture, free from slavery, free from arbitrary detention. And landmark multilateral agreements and institutions like the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty or the International Atomic Energy Agency have reduced humanity's risk of nuclear extinction. And the Kyoto Protocol and the Paris Agreement are performing similar feats for the natural environment by slowing climate change. Global multilateralism brings the sheer heft that is needed to tackle humanity's most fundamental challenges. And that's why the UK cares deeply about multilateralism. We're deeply invested in it. We were one of the architects of it, and we want it to succeed and thrive. And it's a system which has helped reach agreements and compromises, even with those we oppose and compete against. And of course, that is the whole point of multilateralism. And it served our world well for over 80 years. But we have to be honest, that does not mean that it is perfect, nor does it automatically mean that it will survive for the next 80 years. Nothing is inevitable, particularly in an era of growing geopolitical and geoeconomic rivalry. Now, we don't need to reinvent multilateralism, but, as Lord Macaulay said, let us reform that we may preserve. And as a Conservative, that is my natural instinct. It's one of the reasons that I entered politics. And when I apply this principle to transnational issues, it's clear that what we need is a reformed and reinvigorated multilateral system, making it more inclusive, making it more responsive to global challenges like migration, security, development, debt, protectionism, climate change, future pandemics, conflicts, and of course, humanitarian crises. And to do this, we need to think strategically in a way that encompasses every element of multilateralism: the United Nations, NATO, international financial institutions, climate finance institutions, the World Health Organization, international development, international trade, regional organizations. And we want a partnership between multilateral organizations and not competition between these organizations, so that multilateral institutions remain relevant and remain effective. Now, Russia's brutal invasion of Ukraine is a calculated assault on the UN Charter and on the central principles of an international order that was designed, above all, to bring an end to all attempts at conquest and annexation. But of course, war is not our only challenge. In the 2020s, just as in the 1940s, we are living through a turning point in the history of humanity, a period of dizzying and rapid economic, demographic, technological, and social change. The world's economic center of gravity is shifting away from the Euro-Atlantic and towards the Indo-Pacific. Africa's share of world's population is forecast to double from 18% to 37% by 2100, whilst Europe's shrinks from 10% to just 5%, adding to already significant migratory pressures. And as I said at my Mansion House speech in April, global political and military powers are also rebalancing in quick succession. What all this means is that in the coming decades, an even greater share of the world's power will be in the hands of countries in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. Together, they will decide whether the international order will endure. And that's why I've made it my particular focus as Foreign Secretary to engage a far broader array of countries in the Commonwealth, in the Africa Union, in Latin America, in ASEAN, and elsewhere. And I have listened carefully to what they've said. And I've learned a huge amount from my conversation with more than 200 foreign ministers and world leaders over the last 9 months that I've been in this role. And what I have heard from them was that they value the multilateral order. It gives voice to every country in the world. But they also say that they feel the rich countries are hoarding power and neglecting their responsibilities. And the voice of the poor is not always being heard, even on matters that directly concern them. That is why it is so important that we continue listening. The UN's Sustainable Development Goals, sadly, were already well off track before the COVID pandemic and Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And unless we change course, we are due to miss a staggering 88% of them by 2030. Debt threatens to cripple not only the world's poorest countries, but a quarter of middle-income countries too. And we need to negotiate a global pandemic accord before the inevitable moment comes when we desperately need it. And none of these things, none of them, can be delivered without multilateral reform. So it's a legitimate question to ask, what is the UK doing about it? A lot, actually. Over the last decade, we've provided 58 million people with clean energy. We supplied 1.9 billion doses of AstraZeneca's COVID vaccine, the world's first, during the pandemic and at cost price. British investment partnerships will mobilise £8 billion per year in new private sector finance by 2025, creating jobs, boosting productivity, increasing tax revenues in low and middle-income countries. And between 2017 and 2021, British international investment supported businesses that have employed nearly 1 million people, paid £10 billion in taxes, and generated 277 gigawatt hours of electricity. And these are great achievements. We are proud of them. We are rightly proud of them. But I intend to do more, much more. And again, we can only do that if we work multilaterally. And the UK is well placed to do so, because we occupy privileged places in many multilateral institutions. And that gives us not just an opportunity, but also an obligation to improve the effectiveness of the multilateral order. And it is overwhelmingly in our national interest to do so. But I also recognise that we need to restore the British people's faith, their trust in the effectiveness of the international system. And effectiveness comes down to results. And we need to see results both at home and abroad. And this means working across borders to ensure that we have an international framework that can deal effectively with, for example, the disruption of illicit people flows. And that means working upstream. Stopping illegal migration to the UK begins with ensuring that the poorest people in the world have access to clean water, have access to sanitation, have access to basic healthcare and education. Preventing conflict will also reduce the push factors for those people seeking to cross borders. And this is a moral challenge to humanity just as much as it is a political challenge. Poverty reduction, conflict resolution and prevention are core aims of the multilateral system, and the UK will not be found wanting. I've issued clear instructions to my officials that I want to focus on the agendas of emerging powers and developing countries, and not just our own priorities. And what I hear consistently, loud and clear, is that multilateral reform is now overdue. And that's why we welcome Mia Mottley's advocacy for reform of development finance. And I'm delighted that last week's summit on a new global finance pact in Paris made real progress towards a more effective system of international financial institutions. I also value the leadership of Secretary General Antonio Guterres and the leadership that he's shown in championing this agenda and wider UN reform. And it seems obvious to me that the voice of the poorest and most vulnerable countries must be heard at the heart of the multilateral system. And that's why we support permanent membership of the G20 for the African Union and welcome India's leadership on taking this forward. And that's also why the UK has chosen to be a leading partner in the African Development Bank, where African countries hold 60% of the votes. And we've provided guarantees to expand its financing capacity by $3 billion. And we are the largest donor to its fund for poor countries. Now, no single player can deliver multilateral reform. That would be, of course, a contradiction in terms. And that's why we want to work with as broad a coalition as possible, working through the existing mechanisms to build on what we have achieved and to do so collectively, like we did at COP26 with the Glasgow Climate Pact, or on women and girls. And that's why our international women and girls strategy is so important, because, as we all know, everyone gains when women are empowered, where sexual and reproductive health rights are being protected. Or another example, just last week, on marine biodiversity at the United Nations, when 192 countries came together to protect the world's oceans. And that is obviously good if you're a mackerel, or if you're a sardine, or if you're a dolphin, but it's also good for the natural environment, and it also happens to be good for humanity as well. And it shows what we can achieve when we work together. I'm now at the point in the speech where you'll be saying, what exactly are you proposing to reform? So I have 5 transnational priorities. First, reform of the United Nations Security Council. We want to see permanent African representation and membership extended to India, Brazil, Germany, and Japan. And I know this is a bold reform, but it will usher the Security Council into the 2020s. And UNSC reform has happened before, it has grown before, albeit not since 1965. My second priority is reform of the international financial institutions. And this matters for climate finance and, of course, for poverty reduction. And as Mia Motley has argued so passionately and clearly, more investment is needed. And we can find that from existing capital by implementing the recommendations of the G20's independent review. We need multilateral development banks to sweat their existing assets harder. And this will increase the money that they can go on to lend. But in addition to that, we must also make financing easier and quicker to access and maximize the impact of that investment. Now, understandably, there are voices that say that we should be concerned about the bank's credit ratings, and I understand those calls. But our analysis is that the modest changes proposed by the G20 review will protect the AAA credit ratings and also unleash hundreds of billions of dollars for new investment over the next decade alone. Ministers from the countries that need this money are frustrating. And they ask me if the banks are more concerned about protecting their credit ratings than helping the poorest people in the world. And these concerns, these criticisms will not go away unless we act. And we also need to help poor and small countries at risk of natural disasters. Now, of course, we cannot stop earthquakes, we cannot stop droughts, we cannot stop floods. But we can prevent the economic crises and debt spirals that those natural disasters cause. And UK export finance is already doing just that, with climate-resilient debt clauses that they are integrating in loans to 12 partner countries in Africa and the Caribbean. Last week, the United States, Spain, and the World Bank agreed to follow our lead and offer these clauses themselves. But each and every one of these measures will fall short unless we also deliver on my third priority, and that is making sure low and middle income countries have sustainable public finances. We want governments to be able to collect the taxes that are due to them so that they can invest in their own development. And that, of course, would create a virtuous circle. And through better and faster implementation of international tax rules, we can stop revenues leaking from poor countries' national treasuries. But of course, that alone is not enough. We must also help, as we have done with our Commonwealth partners like Ghana, Malawi, and Sri Lanka, as well as others who need it. We've helped them restructure their public debt. And by strengthening debt management capabilities, we can stop poor countries from accumulating vast stocks of unpayable debts at crippling rates of interest in the first place. Which brings me on to my fourth priority: trade. For decades, the WTO, and before that, the General Agreement on Tariff and Trade, stimulated steady growth in the world trade that in turn drove global prosperity. But today, the WTO desperately needs new rules to reflect today's digital economy and not the world of 1995. Trade policy must be free, must be fair, must be open, and not manipulated or distorted. The UK does not subscribe to the belief that international trade is a zero-sum game. Rather, we believe that it is good for both developed and developing countries, that export restrictions create food insecurity. And we have learned from history that vast industrial subsidies have inevitably and eventually need to be abandoned. We've seen that in the past, and why should we believe it will be any different this time round? We need a functioning dispute settlement mechanism to tackle these issues so that each and every country, no matter how large or how small, can have the confidence that their claim will be heard and adjudicated fairly. And if we don't do this soon, there is a real risk that much of the world will turn its back on the multilateral trading rules. And that's why I say again, let us reform that we may preserve. Because free trade and greater investment is in everybody's interest. And my fifth priority: artificial intelligence and quantum computing have the potential to transform humankind's problem-solving capabilities. We are standing at the edge of a gigantic leap forward in the relationship between man and machine, one that will amplify the positives but also the negatives of the tech revolution. And of course, what we see increasingly is that technology is not tied to geography. It knows no national borders. And that's why the UK is championing a multilateral approach to managing artificial intelligence. I will chair the UN Security Council's first ever meeting on this issue in New York next month. And the Prime Minister will host an AI summit this autumn. And our efforts will complement those of the G7's Hiroshima process, the International Telecommunication Union, the Council of Europe, and other multilateral organizations. But we must not neglect the 2.7 billion people who have no internet access at all. And our development work gives millions access to the internet. And the successful conclusion of the UN Global Digital Compact will allow humanity to do even more. And we need to ensure that multilateral development institutions themselves use technology, use artificial intelligence to generate even better results for those in need. And the United Kingdom is rightly one of the largest donors to international development assistance, giving £12.8 billion last year alone. Multilateral programs account for a quarter of that sum because this helps us maximize the efficiency, effectiveness, and value for money of our aid. But we must not shy away from asking tough questions to ensure that that remains the case. And it's also about listening to what others want. Tolerance, and from time to time, agreeing to disagree. We need to be thoughtful about how we engage in multilateral institutions with countries that have different social, cultural, or indeed religious approaches to sensitive moral issues. Yes, by advocating, but not hectoring. Because we have an obligation to future generations to find the areas where we agree. And we will find solutions to global challenges either together or not at all. And I want to proceed with plans for multilateral reform across my 5 priorities in that spirit, while standing up for UK values clearly and unambiguously. And I recognise that multilateral reform is exceptionally difficult to bring about. But it will bring huge, significant benefits for the UK and the wider world. The most important of which, by far, is ensuring an enduring international order, one that is fit for today's challenges rather than yesterday's battle. Multilateralism is not at odds with national sovereignty and democracy. Its purpose is to protect and reinforce that. And that's why multilateralism begins with war and peace. Conflict prevention is as important as ever, but multilateralism has progressed into human rights, health, trade, international disaster response, development, environmental protection, climate change, and much, much more. Some of these challenges are natural, others are man-made. What they all share is their transnational nature. Today's transnational frontier is technology and artificial intelligence. Whatever comes after that will be even less tied to geography and national frontiers, bringing an even greater need for a high-functioning multilateral system and multilateral institutions, which is why we need a long-term focus on incremental reform. Success will not be measured in weeks or months, but more in years and decades. And we will keep at it. We will persevere. And as we do, just like our forebears in the 1940s and 1950s, we will find that what once looked impossible no longer is. Achieving change alongside our partners requires a mix of ambition, realism, and strategic endurance. The journey ahead will be long, will be arduous, but the United Kingdom owes it to humanity to set out along that road in the company of as many like-minded companions as possible, because for all of a multilateral system's flaws, we care about it deeply. And we need it more and more as our world becomes increasingly interdependent. But if we get reform right across my 5 priorities, the prize of a safer, fairer, healthier, more prosperous world will be within our grasp. So, let us reform that we may preserve. Thank you very much.
Foreign Secretary, thank you very much indeed. And it is very striking, as I was saying at the beginning, that a politician from the right of centre comes out with a speech in support of all these institutions. As I was saying at the beginning, a long time since 30 years since we have another example, even 2008 since David Miliband did that. And yet, as you're saying at the same time, you want to see a lot of reform, quite radical, in some of these. So let me pick up one of your most striking points, but you have talked over a great range of things from development finance to women to climate finance to AI and all kinds of things. But I wanted to pick up your thoughts about the United Nations Security Council. And we obviously look at its, as is a long debate, as everyone in this hall will know. We look at its shortcomings, particularly, for example, the crisis over Ukraine. And you've proposed, which a lot of people would support, an increase in the membership of that to better reflect the world that we live in now, to include countries that were not in it when the Security Council was first created. And I'm wondering what you would do with that expansion, with that old predicament of permanent members having a veto, and it's Russia's veto, of course, that has stopped the Security Council condemning the invasion of Ukraine. So would you try at the same time as these reforms to take away the veto?
Well, I think Russia's veto of criticism of its own actions has shone a light on the hypocrisy that has emanated from Moscow on not just this issue, but a number of issues. So it's the United Kingdom and others that are calling for countries in, it's not a phrase I particularly like, but I can't think of a better one, the global south, from having a stronger voice at the United Nations Security Council and other multilateral institutions. Ironically, it's Russia, and we've seen in the narrative through this period of violence that they've initiated, that they've claimed to be the champion of the global south. They've claimed to be the conduit for their concerns. Yet it is inevitably Russia that has acted against the interests of those often poorer people in the southern part of the world, those who are disproportionately feeling the negative impact of energy price inflation, which is a direct result of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, or grain shortages, which is a direct repercussion of Russia's intentional disruption of Ukraine's grain exports. So I think it does, I think their actions do, as I say, highlight their hypocrisy. But one of the things that has also struck me is that when I speak to leaders in Africa, in Latin America, in Southeast Asia, they do say over and over again that they feel that the multilateral system too often talks about the issues which are in the hearts and minds of the Euro-Atlantic region and less about the Indo-Pacific, Latin America, or Africa. And the best way of making sure that that perception is changed and the challenge that they've identified is changed is to make sure they have, at the very top table, a consistent and powerful voice. I think if we do that, some of the issues about vetoes will become perhaps slightly less significant. But as I say, when vetoes are exercised, you can't do it invisibly, and people can see who's actually trying to prevent reform and who the champions of reform are.
Really important point. Thank you very much indeed for that. We've got time for a few questions. Let's go. I'm going to start with one from Salome Nzuki from our panel of young advisors. Thank you. Thank you for being here.
Good morning, and thank you for your profound thoughts on multilateralism. My name is Salome Nzuki. I'm a member of the Chatham House panel of young advisors from Kenya. Recently, the President of the French Republic brought together presidents and other stakeholders for a summit for a new global financing pact. So do you think that debt restructuring for developing countries is necessary and more so to enhance their capacity to contribute on an equal footing to global goals and global pact? Thank you.
This is an incredibly important issue and a very, very good question. And I think we should remind ourselves what debt should be for. It should be to allow countries to build the kind of infrastructure, whether social, physical, to help with their own economic development and help lift themselves out of poverty. So it does play an incredibly important role. I sometimes feel that some debt is actually used as a management tool in international relations, a way of binding countries in, and I think that is an inappropriate use of debt. It shouldn't have that kind of secondary function. And of course, as anyone that's ever been involved in financial services will tell you, whether it's in individual, institutional or international environment, debt that cannot and will not be paid back is of no use either to the borrower or to the lender. I'm very proud, in fact it was in Kenya, it was in the Railway City project, which UK Development Finance was heavily involved in. I launched the first agreement that had climate resilient clauses within it, and I did so literally next to the president at that project. And I was very, very proud that the UK was at the front of making sure that debt is useful, sustainable, and also flexible enough so that in response to natural emergencies, national finances aren't smashed to bits. This is a challenge for Kenya, but it's a particular challenge for small island states who can sometimes see 2, 3, 4, 500% of their GDP wiped out in one bad hurricane season. So you're right, that we need to make sure that debt is sustainable, is repayable, is not corrosive, and is definitely not used for geopolitical leverage. And I'm very, very pleased that Paris had that right at the heart of the agenda. When was it? It was just last week, wasn't it? And we very much subscribe to that philosophy.
Thank you. And I'm struck by the emphasis in your speech on helping countries avoid getting that debt in the first place. Let me here in the centre.
George Grills from The Times. According to reports, you will be the first Foreign Secretary in, I believe, 5 years to go to China next month. Are plans for that visit still on track? And why do you think it's so important to engage? And if I may, a second, on Russia, given the events of last weekend, do you think President Putin's grip on power is slipping?
Well, look, I mean, I was hoping to more do a Q&A about this speech than my previous speech, but I will touch upon it. So my Mansion House speech, I set out the 3 pillars in terms of our relationship with China. One was to make sure we protect ourselves from Chinese activity in the UK that we are uncomfortable with. And the second pillar was to build a strong network of friends and allies both in the region and around the world to make sure that we have a credible alternative proposition to the world. But the third, very, very importantly, was engagement. I very passionately believe that the UK has agency, we have a voice, we have influence, and we should try to utilise that, and that is best done through direct engagement. So the timing and the details of any trip that I might do to China is still yet to be decided. But if as and when I do go, I will, of course, talk about the issues that I have raised in the past, our concerns about their internal human rights activity with the Uyghur Muslims, their attitude towards Hong Kong, concerns over Taiwan Strait and others. But of course, one of the things that I'm very conscious of is how many smaller and poorer countries are very, very, very heavily indebted to China. And if I'm going to drive the reform that I intend to drive in the multilateral system, China is a very significant and influential player in many of those institutions, and therefore engagement with them is an important part of the agenda that I set out in this speech. And with regard to last weekend's events, these, to a large extent, this is an internal matter for Russia. Putin, created, to all intents and purposes, the Wagner Group, and their frictions are up to them. And the leadership for Russia is entirely and exclusively an issue for the Russian people. We will not be distracted. Our commitment is to support Ukraine until they have recovered their sovereignty and then help them rebuild and reform and renew their country after the conflict, and provide them with the military and financial resources to do both of those things. That is the plan. We're not distracted by these events. We're sticking with the plan, and we will continue to stand shoulder to shoulder with them until that plan is successful.
Thank you. And I can take probably only one more. We've got one here on the aisle there.
Good morning. My name is Dipna. I'm a Schilling Scholar from Mauritius. One of the reforms you raised was the inclusion of an African representation from Africa. In practical terms, how would you see that work? Would you think of countries being on a roster on a yearly basis or not? Thank you.
Well, thank you. Look, I'm very, very proud you're a Achieving Scholar. Welcome. The people who join us from all over the world come to our fantastic British universities. It's always a pleasure to meet you, and thank you for getting involved with that. So I know this might feel like a plan half-formed, but I feel very, very strongly that Africa does need a stronger and more permanent voice on multilateral institutions, G20, UN Security Council. Having said that, what I then don't want to do is slip into the perception that I'm then trying to tell Africa how it should discharge the duty of having that stronger voice. So the mechanism for doing so, I think, rightly sits with African leaders themselves. They should, they should work through this. I think that will encourage greater collaboration and cooperation within the continent and the leadership of the continent itself. I think that will be a good thing. So the exact mechanism, that should be a decision for African leaders. But for me, the means is slightly secondary to the ends, and the ends is making sure that Africa has a loud and meaningful and consistent voice at the very, very top table of the multilateral institutions that are so often making decisions that affect the continent. So that's why I've stopped short of saying how it should happen, just that I'm absolutely convinced that it is in our collective global interest, and the UK's interest, and Africa's interest, that it does happen.
Thank you very much for that. And because the pressure's on the Foreign Secretary's time, we're going to have to stop there. There was a forest of hands up, absolutely understandably. I'm really sorry we can't go there. Foreign Secretary, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
All right, we're going to press straight on with the next session, how to achieve a lasting peace in Ukraine. And Chatham House's terrific Russia-Eurasia program has brought out a report, the very strongly argued report just this week on that theme.